Paul the Apostle, a man of flesh and blood. What religions don't tell us. Imagine a young, educated man standing by a pile of stones. He does not throw them himself, but he guards the clothes of those who do. Every stone that strikes the body of Stephen, the first Christian martyr, falls with his approval. This young man's name is Saul of Tarsus, and in a few years he will be known to the world as the Apostle Paul, the author of most of the New Testament. But here lies a paradox rarely spoken of. The man responsible for the death of a Christian carried in his pocket something that could save his life in any situation: Roman citizenship. At a time when the Romans were brutal occupiers of Palestine, and Jewish religious zeal was at its peak, Saul lived in three worlds at once. And perhaps this, not a supernatural vision, was the true key to his transformation. In this presentation, we will look not only at Paul as a stained glass saint, but as a man of flesh and blood, struggling with his own demons and inner conflicts of identity. Why might the blood on his hands have been the real reason for his transformation? How did his double identity, as both Jew and Roman, shape his life? What connects Paul with those seeking a new spirituality after leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses? How could his weaknesses make him so influential? Through this journey we will discover how Paul's conflicts with other leaders of early Christianity reflect differences familiar to anyone who has experienced tensions in religious organizations. We will also talk about the search for identity and spirituality, and how stories of people like Paul can inspire modern adults struggling with similar dilemmas. This is the story of a man who had to face himself. And perhaps it was precisely this that made him so influential. Stay with us to discover how even the greatest weaknesses can become sources of strength and hope. What will we discover today? Over the next several dozen minutes, I will take you on a journey you won't find in any religious textbook. We will meet Saul of Tarsus not as a stained glass figure, but as a man of flesh and blood who wrestled with his own demons, identity conflicts, and the trauma of his past actions. You will learn how the blood on his hands might have been the true cause of his transformation, why his Roman citizenship was as important as his Jewish identity, and why this greatest of apostles was regularly criticized by his own communities for weakness, unattractiveness, and poor oratory. This is the story of a man who had to face himself, and maybe that's why he became so influential. Stay with us. Blood on his hands, Saul and the death of Stephen. The scene unfolds outside the walls of Jerusalem, probably in the year 34 AD. Stephen, one of the first Christian deacons, has just delivered a speech that enraged the Sanhedrin. He accused the religious leaders of killing the righteous one, of resisting the Holy Spirit, of being murderers of the prophets. In Jewish culture, such words were not merely insulting, they were treason. Stephen crossed a line from which there was no return. The Acts of the Apostles describes what followed in neutral terms: they dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. Meanwhile the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. But to understand what really happened, we must look deeper into Jewish law. In the Talmud, we read that the witnesses for the prosecution were required to throw the first stones. This was not a random role, it was a legal and moral responsibility. Saul was not just holding the coats. He was part of the execution system. Every stone that struck Stephen fell with his approval. But that's not all. The Greek text uses the word synudokeo, saying that Saul approved of the killing. This does not mean passive acceptance. It means active participation, intellectual and emotional consent. Saul was no bystander, he was a collaborator in the execution. And then something happened that could have marked him for life. Stephen, as he died, prayed. Not cursing, not begging for mercy. He prayed for his killers: "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." These words, spoken by the man Saul was helping to kill, must have struck him like lightning. In Jewish tradition, the death of a righteous man has redemptive power. But the death of a righteous man who forgives his murderers, that was something no Jewish theologian knew how to interpret. And Saul, a young brilliant mind, remembered that scene forever. Questions for reflection. What experiences in your life have shaken your convictions? Have you ever met someone who changed the way you see the world? A Roman passport in Jewish hands. To understand who Saul was, we must grasp something that may seem abstract to us today: what Roman citizenship meant in the 1st century. Imagine living in a country occupied by a foreign empire. The occupier is ruthless, crucifying rebels, imposing heavy taxes, showing no respect for your culture. But some of your countrymen have documents granting them special privileges. They can appeal against local court verdicts. They cannot be beaten without trial. In critical situations, they can demand a trial in Rome itself. This was Saul's situation. Roman citizenship in the 1st century was more than a document, it was a key to another world. Only about 10% of the empire's inhabitants had this privilege. The rest were peregrini, foreigners, or worse, slaves. Saul of Tarsus lived with this duality every day. On the one hand, he was a zealous Pharisee, believing in the choseness of the Jewish people and in the coming of the Messiah who would free them from Roman rule. On the other hand, he had a document making him part of the very system his religion commanded him to oppose. Tarsus, his hometown, was no provincial backwater. It was one of the great Hellenistic cities, a center of trade and culture, where all philosophical currents of the time met. Saul grew up not only as a Jew, but as a citizen of a cosmopolitan city, where Greek was the everyday language and Roman law regulated social life. Later, as Paul, when he was arrested in Jerusalem, this duality became fully evident. When the Roman commander ordered him beaten, Paul said, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" The reaction was immediate. The soldiers stepped back, the commander grew afraid. The man treated moments earlier as a Jewish agitator suddenly became untouchable. Questions for reflection. What places and cultures shaped your identity? How have you integrated different aspects of your life after leaving an organization? The road to Damascus, what really happened? The story of Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus is one of the most famous episodes in Christian history. But do we really know what happened there? The Acts of the Apostles gives us 3 accounts of this event, and each differs in details. In one version, Saul's companions hear a voice but see no one. In another, they see the light but do not understand the voice. In the third, they all fall to the ground. These are not accidental differences, they suggest the author struggled with describing an event more complex than it appears at first reading. Consider the psychological context. Saul had just participated in the execution of a man who died praying for his killers. Over the following weeks and months, he systematically persecuted followers of the same faith Stephen represented. He entered houses, dragged out men and women, and threw them into prison. But can someone persecute and kill people who behave like Stephen and remain unmoved? Can one watch their courage, their willingness to sacrifice, their mutual love, without asking, what if they are right? Modern psychology knows the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance, a state in which our actions conflict with our deeper beliefs. A person in such a state can function outwardly normally, but the inner tension builds until it explodes into crisis. Did this happen to Saul on the road to Damascus? On the desert road, under the burning sun, after months of persecuting people he secretly admired, did his psyche finally say, "Enough"? Some scholars suggest Saul may have suffered from epilepsy. The descriptions of his vision, sudden light, falling to the ground, temporary blindness, hearing voices, match the symptoms of a seizure. In antiquity, such episodes were often interpreted as encounters with a deity. But perhaps what matters most is what happened afterward. After this event, Saul did not immediately begin preaching the gospel. He went into the Arabian desert and stayed there 3 years. 3 years of solitude, reflection, struggling with what had happened. That does not look like a man who received a ready-made revelation. That looks like a man who had to rework his entire identity. Questions for reflection. What have been your crisis moments that led to transformation? How did times of isolation shape your outlook on life? A man with body and soul, Paul's weaknesses. If you think of the Apostle Paul as a superhuman without weaknesses, prepare for surprise. The man who wrote some of the most beautiful texts about love in all literature struggled with problems that made him very human. Let's start with his appearance. In the apocryphal Acts of Paul and Thecla from the 2nd century, we find the first physical description of the apostle, a man of short stature, bald, bow-legged, strongly built, with eyebrows that met, and a rather prominent nose. Not Hollywood. A real man, and certainly not a model. Paul himself was aware of his physical weakness. In 2 Corinthians, he quotes his critics. His letters are weighty and forceful, but in person he is unimpressive and his speaking amounts to nothing. Paul was not a charismatic speaker. He lacked the natural authority that draws crowds. He had to rely on the power of his arguments, not on charisma. And there's more. Paul suffered from something he called a thorn in the flesh. 3 times he prayed for God to remove it. God did not. What was it? Epilepsy, chronic eye problems, depression. We don't know, but we know it was a real, tormenting physical weakness. And another rarely mentioned fact, Paul was lonely. In a culture where marriage was practically obligatory, where a man without a wife was viewed with suspicion, Paul chose celibacy. But was it a choice, or a necessity? In 1 Corinthians he writes, "I wish that all were as I myself am." Was this advice, or the lament of a man who never found a partner? Perhaps most moving are his words near the end of his life, in 2 Timothy, "Everyone has deserted me." The man who founded dozens of Christian communities, who had hundreds of disciples, died in loneliness. But maybe it was precisely this weakness, this fragility, this awareness of his own limitations, that made Paul such an effective apostle. People did not follow him because he was perfect. They followed him because he understood their weaknesses from his own experience. Questions for reflection. What weaknesses in your life shape your relationships with others? How can you use your limitations to build stronger connections with people? Conflicts and controversies. Church history would prefer us to forget one thing: the Apostle Paul was not unanimously accepted by other leaders of early Christianity. On the contrary, his activity was a constant source of conflict. The most famous clash happened in Antioch, between Paul and Peter. Paul describes it bluntly in Galatians, "I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned." What happened? Peter ate with Gentile Christians, but when emissaries from Jerusalem arrived, he withdrew. Paul accused him of hypocrisy. This was not a minor dispute. It was about the very nature of Christianity. Was it a religion for Jews who believed in Jesus as Messiah, or a universal faith open to all people? Peter represented the Judeo-Christian view. Paul, the universalist one. And he did not hesitate to publicly confront the first of the apostles. But the conflict with Peter was only the tip of the iceberg. In communities Paul himself founded, he struggled for authority. In Corinth, a group of super-apostles questioned his credentials, arguing he had never known the historical Jesus, had not witnessed his earthly life, and that his apostleship was self-appointed. Paul defended himself, but his defense sounds desperate. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? That does not sound like confidence. It sounds like a man trying to convince others, and perhaps himself, of his legitimacy. In Galatia, things were worse. Communities he founded abandoned his teaching and embraced a version of Christianity requiring Gentiles to keep Jewish law. Paul raged, "You foolish Galatians! Who has bewitched you?" This is not diplomatic language. It is the voice of a man hurt and frustrated. Interestingly, even after Paul's death, his legacy was controversial. Peter admits in his second letter that Paul's writings are difficult to understand and that the ignorant and unstable twist them, as they do the other scriptures, to their own destruction. Why does this matter? Because it shows Paul was not the unchallenged authority later history made him. He was a man who had to fight for every success, who was criticized, rejected, sometimes ignored. And maybe that makes him more human, and more real. Questions for reflection. Have you ever felt rejected by a community you committed to? What tensions and conflicts have you faced because of differences in belief? The legacy of a man full of contradictions. Looking at Paul's life from the perspective of 2 millennia, we see a man full of paradoxes. A Roman citizen who spent years in Roman prisons. A Jewish scholar who became the apostle to the Gentiles. A persecutor who became persecuted. A man who preached unity but lived in constant conflict. And perhaps these contradictions are the key to understanding his influence. Paul was not a stained glass saint. He was a man who carried within him all the tensions of his age, between Judaism and Hellenism, between local tradition and universal values, between law and grace, between weakness and strength. His letters, which make up about half the New Testament, are not theological treatises written in library silence. They are documents of a man in constant motion, constant conflict, constant search. A man who tried to reconcile irreconcilable things, sometimes succeeding, sometimes not. Was Paul a great theologian? Undoubtedly. Was he a perfect leader? Hardly. Was he without flaw? Definitely not. But perhaps this is why his message resonates through the centuries, because he spoke from the experience of weakness, failure, doubt, and pain. In the end, isn't that what true spirituality is about? Not being perfect, but being real. Not hiding weaknesses, but finding strength in them. Not living without conflict, but learning from it. Paul, a man of flesh and blood, shows us that transformation is possible even for the worst among us. That the past need not determine the future. That even those with blood on their hands can become instruments of good. And that true leadership is not about being above others, but about sharing in their humanity. This is the story religions would prefer not to tell. Because it shows that even the greatest saints were first of all human. And maybe that's exactly why it is worth telling. Epilogue. What does this mean today? If you've come this far, you are probably asking, what does this story mean for us, people living in the 21st century? Why should the fate of a man who lived 2,000 years ago matter at all? The answer may be simpler than you think. Paul's story is the story of transformation. But not magical, instant, supernatural transformation. It is the story of human transformation, gradual, painful, full of ups and downs. For anyone who has ever had to face the consequences of their actions, Paul's story has deep meaning. It shows that even the worst deeds need not define our future. That guilt, which can destroy us, can also become a force for change. For anyone living with contradictions, and who among us doesn't, Paul shows that we don't need to be one-dimensional to be authentic. We can carry within us different identities, loyalties, desires, and still find a way to live coherently. And finally, for anyone who feels weak, imperfect, inadequate to the tasks ahead, Paul has a message of hope. We don't need to be perfect to do meaningful things. Sometimes our greatest weaknesses become the source of our greatest strength. Paul's story is the story of second chances. And third. And 100th. It is the story of a man who proved there is no past that cannot be redeemed, no weakness that cannot be turned into strength, no failure that must be final. And maybe that is what true spirituality is all about. Not about being someone else, but about becoming who we can be. Step by step, day by day, against all odds.